Glad I passed.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So it's actually surprising to me. I remembered, Adrian, in my the first time I took your administrative law course in U Chicago, because Douglas Baer, the dean who just stepped down when I went to U Chicago to be an LLM student, he said that, oh, Adrian is a great teacher and you should attend his class. I still remembered the moment I sat down and then saw you coming into the classroom. For a few seconds, I thought it's a Chinese scholar who walked in. The way you look, the way you talk, even though it's in English and nothing to do with Chinese law, it feels like you are a Chinese scholar from the ancient times somehow. So you've done a great job that you hide your Chinese skills for so many years, almost 20 years, and now you exposed yourself in front of us. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for making the effort. Okay, so now I think it's a good time for me to hand on the stage to you to start your talk.
Wonderful, thank you. So, as I told Professor Chen, I've never used PowerPoint in my life. So I thought what I would do is do a précis of the paper in case it's helpful. Thank you for your patience. I look forward very much to the thoughts of our very eminent commentators. My subject is the choice of legal form in the administrative state, a three-way distinction among rules, commands, and principles in the administrative state. So let me begin with defining a couple of terms, beginning with the administrative state and its definition. I define it as a state structure in which executive tribunals and administrative bodies possess the power to make binding rules, to issue specific orders, and or to adjudicate violations of those rules or orders, with either initial or final legal effect, whether or not subject to eventual review by a court or an ombudsman or some other body. And this is all under delegation from the highest sovereign lawmaker. The administrative state is here contrasted with an idealized jurisdiction state, in which the highest sovereign lawmaker creates general rules that the executive can enforce in the sense of initiating actions in court, but in which executive bodies are understood to have no power to make binding law in their own right, again, whether or not subject to eventual judicial review. So here's the problem of the paper then. As the administrative state becomes more and more developed, elaborate, and complex in response to an ever more complex economy and a developing society, what happens to the form of legal norms? Do they change, and if so, how? There is a long, tangled tradition of anxiety and debate about this question in European and American legal theory, which I've tried to simplify. I'm sure I've oversimplified it radically. But please take these as ideal types for purposes of discussion. I distinguish three views that I associate respectively with, first, Roscoe Pound, a former dean of the Harvard Law School, who started out as a progressive legal theorist and then somehow transformed himself into a conservative or even reactionary opponent of the administrative state. The second figure is Carl Schmitt, the somewhat notorious Weimar-era legal theorist. And third, Ronald Dworkin, the Anglo-American legal philosopher. In each case, I've oversimplified the theorist's views for clarity, and each is just a stand-in for a whole set of voices. But again, I thought it would be useful to have ideal types. So the three views are this. First view was that the effect of the growing complexity of the administrative state is to produce a transition from general rules to specific ad hoc administrative orders, and that this is good. So this was roughly Pound's view in his initial progressive phase. Pound argued that, especially in the complicated economic organization of today, the law cannot say to the businessman, well, you guess, take a guess. You employ a lawyer by the year to give you the best guess that he can, and then as the result of litigation, we will tell you 5 years afterwards, after the transaction, whether your guess as to the conduct of your business was correct or not correct. We try to tell men in advance what they may do and what they may not, as far as possible. In advance is the key part. And our administrative commissions are nothing but traffic officers, as it were, with signals to tell us when to cross and when not to cross and where to cross. The second view was that the effect of the growing complexity of the administrative state is to produce a transition from general rules to specific ad hoc administrative orders, and that this is bad. So the first and second views share the same prediction, but they have different normative evaluations of that prediction. This is roughly Schmidt's view, at least in the article of his I focus on, his neglected but important article, The Crisis or Plight of European Jurisprudence. In this article, he worried that these developments, the growth of an administrative state, have created a critical situation for jurisprudence, which cannot enter into a race with motorized, he called them motorized directives, meaning rapidly changing methods of administrative decrees and directives. Jurisprudence cannot keep up. Rather, it must become aware of the fact that it has become the last refuge of law. It must remember its own tasks and seek to safeguard the unity and consistency of law, which is being lost in the frenzy of legal imposition. Now, Schmidt, in my view, had no plausible solution to this problem, but I think there is a solution in the third view. The third view, which I associate with Ronald Dworkin, is that both Pound and Schmidt are wrong in their common assumption that the growing complexity of the administrative state would produce a transition from general rules to ad hoc orders. I should qualify that by saying they're partly wrong, or wrong in important respects. Rather, on Dworkin's view, the response to increasing complexity, a response taken by both higher order lawmakers, for example, legislators, or by judges crafting jurisprudence in the administrative state, would be something different. It would be an increasing reliance on what Dworkin called principles, general principles of law. So, in a sense, this is not a denial of Schmidt's view, but a solution to the concern that Schmidt posed. So this triumph of principles as a legal form in the administrative state is something that Dworkin argued for on several occasions, and he puts it this way. Elaborate statutory schemes became increasingly important sources of law, but these schemes were not and could not be detailed codes. They were more constructed of general statements of principle and policy that needed to be elaborated in concrete administrative and judicial decisions. If judges had continued to say that law stopped where explicit sovereign discretion ran out, they would have had constantly to declare that legality was either irrelevant to or compromised in their judgments. The thesis that a community's law consists only of the explicit commands of legislative bodies seems natural and convenient when explicit legislative codes can purport to supply all the law that a community needs. When technological change and commercial innovation outdistance the supply of positive law, however, as they increasingly did in the years following the Second World War, judges and other legal officials must turn to more general principles of strategy and fairness to adapt and develop law in response. It then seems artificial and pointless to deny that these principles, too, figure in determining what law requires. So for Dworkin, these principles are themselves part of the law. They're not a departure from the law in the service of political morality or something else. They themselves are part of it. On Dworkin's account, principles are a special type of legal norm. They have dimensions of both scope and weight, and that last part is crucial. Unlike party-specific ad hoc commands, they are general in form. So, for example, the principle that no party should be able to judge their own case is general in form. Unlike rules, however, they have a dimension of weight. Whereas a rule can only be either complied with, violated, or trumped by a higher order rule, principles have this feature that they can be outweighed. They can be outweighed by competing principles or displaced, as it were, by very clear and specific textual commands with respect to a specific subject. The main use of principles is not at all to override positive law. It's interpretive. They're used in what Dworkin called hard cases to interpret general, vague, or ambiguous positive texts. So there is a presumption that the positive lawmaker speaks against the background of these principles and intends to follow them in texts. In cases of conflict between or among principles, Dworkin recurred to a meta-principle of local priority. If the facts of the situation in the case fall within the core of one principle, but only arguably within the scope of another, the former will be taken to outweigh the latter. So much for the three views on legal form in the administrative state. I go on in the paper to use the American administrative state as a case study, and I argue it strongly supports Dworkin's claim. Here the paper becomes for me intertwined with a recent book I co-authored with Cass Sunstein. It's called Law and Leviathan. I should say that Cass is not responsible for anything I say here, but in my view, the point of the book is to say that the right picture of legality in the administrative state does not have anything to do with political concepts like democracy or liberty or any of the other usual approaches. Rather, it has to do with what we call in the book the internal morality of administrative law. And we draw on Lon Fuller's work on the preconditions and procedures that make for legality. So this internal morality of administrative law appears most clearly in American administrative law in a set of Dworkinian principles that the courts either use to interpret the vague and general provisions of our Administrative Procedure Act, or else the courts simply invoke without specifying any written source, any source of written law at all. For the Administrative Procedure Act, it's in my mind a perfect example of Dworkin's thesis that lawmakers would start to create framework laws or general laws that are not detailed, very specific codes, but rather themselves embody general principles. So, for example, one of the very core commands of our Administrative Procedure Act is that the action of agencies may not be arbitrary and capricious. But what counts as arbitrary and capricious is the subject of a very thick body of jurisprudence that relies on all sorts of general legal principles. An example is the defeasible principle. It can be outweighed. A defeasible principle that agencies should give reasons for changing their policies if the change interferes with the reliance interests or settled expectations of regulated parties, for example, a business planning a transaction. An example of the second phenomenon I discuss, in which courts simply invoke general principles without specifying any sort of written law at all, is the defeasible principle in our administrative law that agencies must follow their own previously enacted general rules unless and until properly changed. There is no text in our positive law to which one can point as a source for that unless you point to a very general clause in our Constitution that speaks of due process of law, but what that means is profoundly unclear. In any event, when the Supreme Court announced this principle of administrative law in 1932, it didn't bother to ascribe it to any source of positive law. It just simply treated it as a sort of inherent corollary of administrative rulemaking authority. I think, and this is now getting beyond my competence, but relying on authorities, I think this is true of the European case as well. So a recent summary of European administrative law puts it this way. In all of the European legal systems studied in this book, general principles have been at the center of the development of administrative law. In all jurisdictions, the administrative law regime has been shaped by the case law of the courts, applying certain general principles before the administrative law was codified by the legislature. Many of these principles of administrative law are rooted in the rule of law. So, again, the general principles to which I refer are principles of legality. They're not directly related to other political concepts. So, that's all I had to say, and I want to end by just throwing out a question for our esteemed discussants and colleagues. Whenever I present a paper like this in a forum like this, I worry that I'm being parochial, that I'm saying something strictly of local interest. So to what extent is Dworkin's analysis parochial? Is it just about American and perhaps European administrative law? I'd love to hear from people about the 1990 Code of Administrative Procedure in China and see if it fits this model in any way. Or if it's a counterexample, that's valuable as well, because then we could start to figure out the conditions under which Dworkin's thesis will or will not hold. So thank you, that's all I had to say, and I look forward to your thoughts. And please forgive me if I seem to be typing while you're talking. I'm just taking down your thoughts for my own benefit. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. You are strictly following the norm in Chicago still, or is it the same norm in Harvard? 20 minutes, very, very precisely. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know you must be worrying that people would raise hands and rushing to stop you. Okay, yeah, we will collect the question and then we will have conversation when we go along. So now I want to first turn to Professor. Okay, we will also strictly follow our rules that we set out in the poster. We formally invited the three commentators to this talk, and we will start from them, and then we will get more comments over the time. So first of all, I'll turn to Professor Zhang Yongle of Peking University Law School. Professor Zhang, please.
Great. 你好，魏安正老师. It's my great pleasure to be a discussant. I enjoyed the talk very much. I think this is not only a nice work in administrative jurisprudence, but also an inspiring work in intellectual history, as well as a sophisticated eulogy of the achievement of the administrative justice of the U.S. In the work, you used Pound and Schmidt to raise the question, and then used Dworkin and the practice of the U.S. judicial review as the answer. On the question side, the two figures crystallize the challenge of the time in the 20th century. After the First World War, the classical liberalism was fading worldwide with the rise of communism, Keynesianism, fascism. The administrative state seems to be the answer everywhere. Positivism as an intellectual resource accelerates this process, but also stirs hostility. You discussed Carl Schmitt's famous piece, The Plight of European Jurisprudence. This piece is very important for the question side. Carl Schmitt tried to posit jurisprudence between techno-positivism and the theology. For his diagnosis is that the problem of the rising administrative state is that it tends to bring the rule of technology, which will further lead to the oblivion of the political, as defined by Carl Schmitt. And the German theorists from Heidegger to Carl Schmitt were very critical of this direction. For Schmitt, this is a crisis of the European public law. And I also saw you mention Hayek together with Schmitt. Interestingly, there was an unholy alliance between Hayek and Carl Schmitt. Although they have different political orientation, their understanding of what means by the general rule was very surprisingly similar. And Hayek quotes Schmitt many times in his works. Of course, I think that they have different answers for the administrative state. For Hayek, really want to go back to the classical liberalism, but for Carl Schmitt, what you want is a kind of plebiscitary dictatorship where the sovereignty will be respected, rather than what he has seen in the administrative state, the fragmentation of the authority. So I do think that Carl Schmitt do have an answer to the question of the administrative state, but this answer does not fit our today's standard of rule of law. And then you put working on the U.S. practice of judicial review as the answer. The former provides systematic theory, but might not fully realize the practical implication of his theory. The latter needs a theoretical representative, and you make the connection elegantly. When I see you quote Schmitt by the end of the paper, I found the implication being that the U.S. theory and practice successfully solved the crisis of European public law and defended the idea of rule of law in the Western civilization. Then I have three questions. First of all, let me ask a Foucauldian question. When Carl Schmitt and Dworkin discusses principle, they are referring to a zone between general rule and specific command. But within this zone, do they refer to exactly the same thing, or they have very different concerns? Especially if we think about, Carl Schmitt has a very strict concern about the technology. So, what do you think about something like procedure, the procedural requirement? He might relate that to technology. So this is my first question. The second question is that the perspective of comparative law. You mentioned the European administrative law, and I feel very interested. While the U.S. developed such a system of judicial review based on principles, then what about Britain and major European states? I really think that if you could elaborate on that and explain, while the U.S. is the exemplar of such a universal approach, what is its uniqueness? I think we will learn from that. And finally, I have a final question related to the current practice of administrative state. While the COVID-19 was spreading all over the world, so how do you think how did the principle was used in the current judicial review related to the COVID-19 in the U.S.? So basically, I have these three questions. Thank you. Look forward to your answers.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. Adrian, do you want to address these questions one by one, or do you want to collect a few and then respond? it's all up to you. We have
my principle is, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So you tell me how you'd like to proceed.
Okay. So Adrian, how about we let the three commentators to provide their comments and questions for the first round. You can provide some response after that, and then we collect more questions from the audience. Would that work for you?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, now we turn to Professor Doris.J from Peking University Law School.
Hi, Professor Vermeule and also everybody. Good evening. I think it's very clear and thought-provoking presentation. I like it a lot. Also, I did have the opportunity to read your paper next, which is brilliant, by the way. But I do still have questions, or I guess a mixture of questions and comments, which I would like to raise here to you, to see your opinion. I guess first question still, I think my sort of impression about your thesis is still very much the kind of court-focused sort of administrative law, right? We're still talking primarily about how the courts of judiciary might take a stance towards whatever's happening inside the administrative state. But what about what's going on within the administrative state? What about the changes of the legal norms or the formats of the legal norms within the administrative state, right? So I guess, on one hand, of course, as you said, because things are becoming increasingly complex. So, there are a lot of ad hoc decisions made by, all sorts of administrative agencies. But on the other hand, I guess there might be another trend or a sort of changes happening, or not necessarily changes, but I guess it might be a trend, which is the rules, a lot of bright line rules of first general applicability, but also a higher, increasing level of specificity or a level of granularity being made by high-level agencies, so as to curtail or control the behavior of low-level bureaucrats, right? So there's actually another way of the rules changing, which is we do have a lot of rules, but now the rules are both general but also specific in terms of the commands that it is given by the bureaucracy itself or by the administrative state itself to the low-level workers, because now you have an expansive or ever expanding apparatus. So there's this kind of internal control, demand for it, right? So I wonder how that actually fits into your sort of framework, right? So from my perspective, seems there might be another sort of category that might be useful here, which is the kind of bright line rule versus mushy standard, or standard that would need to be given content to ex post, right? So I'm wondering why you're not making any reference to that framework or distinction. So that's my first reaction here. The second reaction is, I guess, of course, principles are important for administrative law or for a judicial review or jurisprudence about judicial behavior at this point where you do have expanding administrative state. But I guess we do have, in legal theories, there are always different conceptions of what principles really are, right? So you might have, the Fullerian, concept of principle, which is to be pretty thin. Whereas you might have the Dworkinian idea of, sort of a principle which are relatively thicker and more laden, right? And you have to have a part related sort of concept of principles. So I guess here the question is, if the purpose is to sort of police or at least, give some sort of legality to the administrative state, and also try to make sure that we do control or avoid the worst case scenario where there are going to be a lot of abuses because there are too much discretion. Then, so what kind of principle that might suffice for that purpose? Because I guess all we're talking about is really about that, that sort of ramification, right? So here, I guess that relates goes back to my first point. For example, if now in administrative state, within administrative state, there are increasingly, these kind of bright line rules being made, which are relatively hard, also being made by the relatively sophisticated agencies. And now back in the courts, which are supposed to review them, with these principles. And if you are only having some very kind of broad and vague principles, will they suffice? Or, for example, maybe do we really want to give the court some more, some kind of power which they can use some sorts of bright line rules so that they could really intervene into the operation of this administrative state? So that's the second question. Third question is also, this is really just curiosity, I guess. I'm wondering why you're not mentioning or making reference or interacting with the legal process school here, right? So, because my understanding of your proposal for administrative law is really principle-based, and also the principles are relatively thin version of principle and legality. So you basically said, okay, look, the most important principle here is really, the process-based kind of constraint that we should give to to police the decision-making process of administrative state, right? So I guess that's, of course, the Fullerian, thesis on internal morality of law, of course, that's very relevant here, and that could be a useful framework. What about some other sort of process-based jurisprudence? Do you think those can be useful or relevant here? This is really just a curious question. It's not to say that you have to do that. I'm just curious about why I don't see them here. Thank you. So those are my reactions.
Okay. Adrian, I hope you're taking good notes of all these fabulous questions.
This is great. I'm having flashbacks to the University of Chicago with these wonderful and rigorous questions, so I'll hope to do them justice.
Thank you. Okay, now we will turn to Professor Feng Chun, who's also Professor of Administrative Law and Constitutional Law in our law school.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen, and thank you for your talk, Professor Vermeule. It's nice to see you in person. Actually, I have 4 points or comments or questions. The first is about background. As you mentioned in your talk, it is based on the paper, and of course, it has a larger background, which is the book you co-authored with Professor Cassidy, which is called Law and the Violence. I would like you to just elaborate more on for the Chinese audience, because not everyone in the audience have read the book or are very familiar with the debate in the United States about the fundamental legitimacy of administrative law. Because to many Chinese law students or even law scholars, that would seem a bit odd to ask the question whether or not administrative law or administrative state is lawful or legitimate at all. Because when we talk about law, it must be lawful, right? And so I would like to ask you to share some background with the Chinese audience to help us better understand what you are trying to do in your book and your paper and your talk today. So that is the first question. The second question is a descriptive one, which is kind of similar to the point just raised by Professor Zhang. And that question is, what counts as law? Because as you mentioned in your talk and in your paper, the reaction or the solution of the United States to the rise of administrative state is the proliferation of principles or legal principles in administrative law. Of course, that is, I think, a quite accurate description of the transformation of United States law, especially given the case that you have raised in your paper and in your talk. The APA of 1946 is a prime example of that. But at the same time, I think there is a kind of double movement in the transformation of the administrative law as well in the United States, especially in China, where alongside the proliferation of legal principles, I think there is also a proliferation of bylaws of course, rulemaking by the delegated legislation, rulemaking by the administrative state itself, as well as you mentioned in your paper, discretionary standards. And that is particularly relevant for the Chinese case, where since the turn of this century, a landmark development of Chinese administrative law is the rise of discretionary standards provided by higher up administrative agencies to the lower level administrative agencies, or by the administrative agencies themselves to demonstrate what they're going to do in particular cases to the market or to the society. So I think at the same time that when the judiciary is using legal principles to constrain administrative power or constrain the ever-growing administrative state, the administrative state itself is adapting itself by making more and more rules at the same time, and sometimes even very specific rules to flesh out quite general and abstract legislative commands. So back to the second question, which is a descriptive one, is why do you think, or why are you confining what is law as to legal principle and count out, in my view, some counting out the rules and especially discretionary standards made by administrative agencies themselves? My third point, and also a question, is a prescriptive one. I agree with you, and of course, Professor Castaing, that it's either futile or unhelpful, at least, to refute the basic legitimacy of administrative state, because it is elephant in the room, it is already here, you cannot roll it back, for all sorts of reasons. However, I think there's also a case to be made for the other side of the argument, which you raised very elegantly in your book, is that the fear of the abuse of administrative powers, especially the kind of royal prerogative-like administrative powers of the administrative state. I recently read a piece by a European scholar on the particularly authoritarian nature of administrative law as compared with civil law or private law and criminal law. Partly because, as you mentioned in your talk, administrative law is full of legal principles, which are relatively abstract. So it's unlike private law or contract law or tort law or even criminal law, where the rules are much, in his opinion, much more specific and concrete. So in that way, administrative law is particularly prone to become an instrument of the authoritarian government. So if that is the case, without refuting the fundamental legitimacy of administrative law, what benefit can we get in terms of reassuring ourselves that administrative law is okay and it can stay with us, and we should not worry as much as the other side of the argument does? My final point is, partially a response to your last remark on bringing in the Chinese perspective. In my view, alongside your way to approach or to understand, conceptualize administrative law and administrative state, focusing on, as it were, the contents or the game, I'd rather propose another alternative approach that is more focused on the players or the institutions of the game. By that I mean, of course, legal principles are very important, and it's perhaps the last bastion of rule of law in more and more complex and growing administrative state. But the focus, or what's more important, perhaps just for the Chinese audience, is that who is using those legal principles? without a robust and independent and strong judiciary to use that principle, even if those principles are enshrined in black letter laws, statutes, or even in constitutional texts, we cannot imagine that legal principles can be useful or can be helpful in bringing or ingraining in the Ministry of State. So the alternative approach I would like to propose is to perhaps at the same time of looking at what rules and principles are used in controlling the Ministry of State, but the balance of power between different institutions in a state, in a government. I raise that point because I have been doing research on the, as I mentioned to you in our exchange of emails, I was doing research on the understanding or conceptualization of administrative state by Chinese scholars. Of course, that idea, that concept, was transplanted from the US jurisprudence. However, I found in the last 30 or 40 years, the Chinese scholars have also struggled with the idea of administrative state, and they have different, divergent conceptions of administrative state. But none of them, at least, very few of them, have realized that when we talk about administrative state in English or 行政国家 in Chinese, on the two sides of the Pacific, we're not talking about the same thing. The United States administrative state is taking place, or is taking its shape against the background of a long entrenched tradition of separation of powers. That's why you have this dichotomy between jurisdiction state and administrative state. However, in China, we reject the idea of separation of powers. So the Chinese scholars are using the concept in a different way. But I find it very interesting because the Chinese scholars are using American jurisprudence as a way to criticize the strong government, the strong administrative state in China. But I think that's some kind of misunderstanding of the situation where the Chinese administrative states arise against the background of a totally planned economy. So in the past 40 years, the administrative state in China is actually decreased rather than increasing or growing. So I think that creates a lot of rooms for the courts to maneuver, to operate in terms of controlling the administrative state. And also it creates a room for whatever legal principles in administrative law to flourish or to be emerged. Actually, Professor Shen is one of the leading administrative scholars who proposed that in Chinese administrative law, we should pay more attention to legal principles. For example, I think sometime around 20 or 25 years before, there wasn't any mentioning in Chinese statutes about, for example, due process or legitimate expectations. But now they're part of Chinese law. And the fundamental reason for that is the decreasing or the shrinking or the diminished, in a sense, of Chinese administrative state. So that's why I tend to argue that perhaps an alternative approach is more universal, at least more suitable for analyzing the Chinese source. Thank you.
Okay, so Adrian, how are you doing that with all these lines of questions and challenges in front of you? Okay, I'll let you to address these questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. These questions are terrific and rigorous, and I'm not sure that I will be able to extemporize satisfying answers to them, but hopefully we can at least start a conversation. So let me start with Professor Zhang. I love the description of the unholy alliance between Hayek and Schmidt. I think that's exactly right. On the three questions, the first question that I think is fundamental, which is if a principle hovers in a zone between the general rule and the specific command, might it be that Schmidt and Dworkin have very different concerns about it? Schmidt is concerned about technology overwhelming jurisprudence in some sense, and might he see procedural requirements as technology? I think the point about his fundamental concern is extremely well taken, but I think I might raise questions about the minor premise, that is, whether procedural requirements are seen as modernist technology in this framework. And the reason I would do so is this. In my view, Schmidt is best seen, and this is a way of seeing him that is, I think, much more common in Europe, and I'm perhaps venture to say in China than in the US. But Schmidt is best seen as a theorist of the jus commune, of the heritage of European jurisprudence. And from the beginning of the jus commune, procedural requirements are part and parcel of jurisprudence. So the principle that a party must be given notice before they can be proceeded against in court is as old as European law and is variously ascribed to natural law or to natural law codes in that jurisprudence. So too, likewise, the principle of administrative law I mentioned, that agencies must follow their own rules, is a principle seen all the way back in the Roman Republic, and it's codified in a lex, I want to say lex Cornelia in 67. That may be wrong, but it's codified quite early. So for Schmidt, these are part of the heritage of jurisprudence, not a modern addition to jurisprudence. So I think that I fully agree with the major premise, but I think I take a different view of the minor premise. Professor John says, what about the UK? Is the American case unique? So this is a deep and interesting question. When I was speaking about European administrative law, I should have qualified with continental European administrative law, which I'm persuaded is importantly a jurisprudence of principles. The UK is in some respects the last bastion of real positivism in that world, and that's true of a bunch of the Commonwealth legal systems, that they have retained a commitment to positivism that I think, if Dworkin is correct, has been importantly abandoned in continental European and American administrative law. So that's a useful distinction to make, and thank you for making it. COVID-19 is, we could have a conference in itself on that question. Fuller, of course, thought that not everything government does had to be subjected to the internal morality of law. So he thought that there was a domain of governmental decisions that were simply outside the internal morality of law. If you like, you can call it the step zero. That is, the step zero question is whether the type of government action at issue is subject to principles of legality in the first place. And when it comes to COVID-19, I think what became clear, at least in the United States, I won't speak to any other cases, is that much of the governmental response to COVID-19 was affected managerially in ways that Fuller himself might have thought were outside of his principles of legality. I'm happy to talk more about that if people want, but I just want to make clear there's a kind of domain restriction on the thesis that we talk about at length in the book. I should have mentioned it in the talk. So I hope I'm not taking too long. I'll try to speed up a little bit. Professor Dai, thank you for your very helpful and searching comments. I wanted to say on your first one that I don't mean to have a solely court-focused treatment. So part of the story I'm trying to tell is about legislative codes of administrative procedure. This is why I refer to the Administrative Procedure Act. So the triumph of principle, at least in the American administrative state, is a kind of joint enterprise. It's a joint enterprise between and among, really, Congress, the executive, and the courts, and Congress creates this code that has some specific provisions, but it has these very general abstract provisions, reference to the public interest, which has to be construed by courts, reference to arbitrary and capricious agency action, which has to have some theory of political morality poured into it. So this really is a cooperative venture. Even within the executive branch, in some of the notes in the paper, I just mentioned briefly some law within the executive branch. You're right that it's absolutely not the focus of the paper, but as I say in the notes, I think a parallel argument could easily be made. So if we look at the framework executive orders from Presidents Obama, Trump, and now Biden that govern administrative decision-making, all of them, I think, are best described as charters of general principles. So President Obama instructed agencies to consider values that are difficult or impossible to quantify, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. President Trump did something similar for reliance interests and unfair surprise. President Biden's executive order, which I don't have in the notes, is probably even the best example of this. It says that agencies should act as sort of stewards of the common good and lays out a series of subheadings to that effect. So absolutely, you're right. There's a version of this paper that could have been written with more attention to matters inside the administrative state. I just have not written it. Let me take Professor Dai's second and third questions together and treat them with reference to the differences, if you like, among legal process, Hart and Sachs, Dworkin, Fuller, all these figures who in important respects talk about principles as an important legal form. The differences are real and important, and I don't mean to downplay them, but I do think that we have to focus on the kind of what's the first decimal issue and what's the second decimal issue. So the first decimal issue, the main fault line, is between positivism and any version of non-positivism in American jurisprudence. And in that sense, Fuller, Hart and Sachs, Dworkin are all on the non-positivist side of the divide, and the commonalities among them are far greater than the differences. I take the differences to be somewhat second decimal. Absolutely, Hart and Sachs could be folded into this picture. When they write the Administrative Procedure Act is quite new, and the revolution that happens in our administrative law in the 1960s and 70s that I really see as the full flowering of the jurisprudence principle has not yet taken place. So in that sense, they're slightly less useful for my purposes, but their jurisprudential framework is absolutely the same, that we interpret positive law against the background of this rich tradition of general legal principles. So I hope I've addressed at least some of your concerns. I'm sure I haven't addressed all of them. Professor Peng, thank you for giving me a chance to say just a bit about Law and Leviathan. I suspect that debate is puzzling to friends and colleagues from China. It's puzzling to me. It's puzzling to me because I do not share the worry that there's some fundamental illegitimacy to the administrative state, and on some level I find that worry deeply puzzling. The book is written not as an expression of our first order views in that debate. I've written my first order views in that debate in other books, one called Law's Abnegation. The book is written against the background of an important legal movement in the United States that does question the legitimacy of the administrative state and wants to return to what it takes to be the original constitutional order, something like a jurisdiction state. One of the views that we put out in the book is, and this may be stronger than my co-author would say, but I think it's true, is that the vision of the original jurisdiction state is fictional, that it never existed, that it is what Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, called an invented tradition that has been retro-projected onto the American past. But for purposes of the book, we try to take the argument seriously. And what we propose is that the Fullerian framework is a second best. That is, it's not going to fully accommodate the concerns of anyone who thinks the administrative state is fundamentally illegitimate. Nothing would accommodate those concerns. But the Fullerian approach offers a tolerable second best that not only constrains but channels the administrative state in productive directions, in the direction of the common good. So our intervention in the debate is not an attempt to fully satisfy the critics, because I don't think that's possible, but it's an attempt to offer a tolerable equilibrium to them. Okay, let me take some of Professor Pung's other questions together, if I can, and speak about whether administrative law is prone to become an instrument of authoritarian government, and the whom question, that is, principles may be neglected if the people applying the principles are in some way not committed to the enterprise. I think that is all indisputably true. I have no quarrel with it. My concern about it is a kind of risk myopia. That is, that when we express those concerns, valid as though they may be, we are focusing only on one side of the ledger. And we have to focus as well on countervailing risks. The countervailing risk for the administrative state is private abuse of power. And I emphatically want to put private here in scare quotes, because the corporations and other entities that can abuse so-called private power are licensed by the state. They enjoy their power under rules of state law, including common law rules of property and tort. And one of the claims of the administrative state is actually to free citizens from authoritarian abuse, a particular type of authoritarian abuse that is affected by corporations and other private actors acting under color of law. So in that sense, we can't associate the administrative state with authoritarian threat and associate whatever our other baseline would be, some common law baseline with some state of liberty. We have to, I think, have a double-sided picture of the relevant risks. And I think this does relate to the whom question of who's applying the principles. This is a fundamental question, but in a sense it's so fundamental it applies, I think, to everything. That is, rules may also be neglected, interpreted narrowly, left to fall into desuetude, or simply ignored by judges or other actors who are not committed to them. So what we need to do is to have a separate conversation about the relationship between legal form on the one hand and the problem that the law in action may not correspond to the law in the books on the other hand. And I think that would be a long and complicated conversation, but the whom problem would apply just as much, at least initially. At least we'd have to have the conversation just as much for other types of legal form, as well as for legal principles. Professor Peng's comments about the Chinese conception of the administrative state were absolutely fascinating to me. The difference between what you called the Chinese conception, which is not carried out against the background of the separation of powers, and the American conception would diminish or disappear on the conception of separation of powers I hold, in which the administrative state is not in some way in tension with the separation of powers, but is actually a product of the separation of powers operating as it was intended to. So in this other book, Law's Abnegation, the thesis is the administrative state is fundamentally legitimate because it has been produced by the institutions of the separation of powers who have, in effect, decided over a long period of time to abnegate themselves, to commit their authority to the new administrative state. So I just throw that out as a thought about a possible way to interestingly compare and contrast, or maybe diminish the difference between the Chinese and American conceptions. But other than that, I should just be quiet now because my learning curve about Chinese administrative law has a lot of growing to do. Let me put it that way. So thank you very much, and I'd love to hear more from our discussants or others.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. So before I open the floor for our other audience, may I use my privilege as the host to pose a question and also comment, because I think I'm probably the only one in this room who does private law or dealing with the big power corporations that you mentioned just now. You set to the background as the administrative state being someone who's supposed to be the guardian of customers, small investors, and citizens in front of the rise of these big modern corporations. And in that sense, I think we have similar situation in China. In the past few decades, I think China produced one of these largest and most influential modern corporations in history ever. If you look at the size of IPOs, it sets the record in almost every major stock exchange. So I think we definitely share that. But relating to the commercial world, you start introducing Dworkin's theory by stating that his problem is really about the predictability for the business world, one of the problems that he sets for himself. But Adrian, wouldn't principle itself really introducing more predictability, or does it make actually less predictable for the business? I teach business law, and I was their lawyer, these corporations lawyer. I think from the real world point of view, the business would definitely welcome rules, specific rules, no matter how outdated it is, how bad it is, it doesn't matter. People would just take that into account and make their plan, no matter how bad it is. But if you tell people that I'm going to give you a principle for you to make plan for your future, I think that will be the worst scenario for any business, either in the United States or in China. So my question is really, has Dworkin really addressed his questions, his problem, by stating the fact that principles are taking on the stage, are getting more important in modern administrative states? And secondly, I think this is more relating to your theory, is that when you echoed Dworkin's conclusion But what's the implication in your framework about two things? One is the discretional power. I think this relates to Professor Peng's question. Does that mean that no matter who's interpreting these principles, who's applying these principles, would necessarily enjoy more legitimacy in their discretion power? Does that mean that they necessarily need to exercise more discretional power in interpreting and applying principles in the modern world? And the second question that I have about your understanding of the implication of the fact that principles are increasingly important is the allocation of power between administrative agency and court. I agree with Professor Peng that China came to the administrative world with a totally different background. The court has been weaker, and partly the reason is not that we wanted to be smaller or whatever. In most of the situation, the reason that court chose to stay smaller is largely because of information and expertise, which I recall that you emphasize a lot in the modern world, right? They knew that they knew much less about business world. They can't really have a meaningful conversation with the big corporations. So they step back a little bit, and then the administrative agencies who knows them better, who can handle them better with the information and expertise, then step up. Is that one of the implications of your theory as well? Okay, that's all. Thank you. And Adrian, do you want to address this, or maybe I will open floor to two audience in our room, Professor Shen Kui and Professor Xie Xia.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen, and thank you, Professor Vermeule. Okay, thank you for your wonderful lectures and your response to my colleagues' comments and questions. Actually, I have learned a lot. Initially, I did have my comments and questions. I wrote them down on my paper, but unfortunately, Professor Peng just now spoke out most of my notes I wrote down on my paper. So I'd like to add some words about your question raised to us. That is the question of whether China is an example or counterexample to Dworkin's theory. As to the background of administrative state in China, I'd like to say, China is also in kind of administrative state, but we can say China is an administrative state with Chinese characteristics. And historically, we had a very different or totally different path to administrative state. And just as Professor Peng mentioned, the administrative state in China originated from the planned economy, in which administrative agencies in China have had very, very huge or large power, discretionary power to control everything, almost everything. And without any check and balance from other institutions, particularly from the courts. But I think with the significance of the market is recognized by the authority and also by the people. The control of the power of administrative agencies was recognized as very important. in the development of China's industrialization or modernization. So against this common recognition, we actually have a very interesting legal development in China in the field of administrative law. I say very interesting because we had a law, a very important law that is called administrative delegation law, promulgated in 1989, and just before the Tiananmen Square event. So fortunately, we had the law, and then we have administrative penalty law, which tries to control the a kind of administrative act which is called administrative penalty, and administrative penalty is widely used by agencies to regulate a lot of areas. So then we have a law that is called administrative license law, which is try to control administrative license. So, and we also have state compensation law, and which tries to give redress or give redress to the people whose rights and interests are infringed by administrative agencies. So from the development of these laws, we can see China actually has been trying to use the general rules to control the administrative power. And the tendency is not, I think, is not decreasing. I mean, for now, we are thinking about the possibility of making administrative law code. I mean, it's very very interesting, because one of the reasons why we want to make the administrative law code is very simple. It's just we have civil law code. So but you know, the issue caused a lot of debates, and I just want to say the tendency, we still have the tendency to use the general rules to control the agencies. But on the other side of China administrative law development, I recall maybe since the end of 1990s, we can see courts in China have been trying to use general principles or legal principles to control the administrative power. And because we have learned a lot from the Western countries in terms of the legal principles in administrative law, such as principle of proportionality, principle of good faith, principle of legality, and also just as Professor Peng mentioned, principle of due process. And yeah, in the past like 20 years or more than 20 years, the courts increasingly use these rules or use these principles to decide their cases when they cannot find specific rules that is appropriate for them to decide the case. So, yeah, that's the other side of the China administrative law story. But I think my take on this this double-sided picture is the side of legislation in the administrative law is more important than the use of general principles by the courts in China. Because as Professor Peng mentioned, we actually have a very different legal culture. One side of the legal culture is like we say we are similar to the continental legal culture. We don't have a common law tradition. And other side, we have a tradition of Chinese law. That means in China, the status of the courts, is not like the status in the United States, not like the courts in the European countries. And our judges oftentimes feel very weak when they decide the hard cases, particularly when the administrative power is very powerful, to make some rules or decisions, particularly in some cases like taking lands and also taking houses from the private owners. So yeah, we have such kind of legal culture in which our judges maybe feel very hard for them to use the general principles very widely to decide the hard cases. Yeah, these are my my comments I'd like to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Both of those sets of comments were very illuminating, and I want to say a few words in my conversation with Professor Chen, and then speak to what was just said, because that's extremely interesting as well. So on the first part, are principles actually more confusing for businesses? I think there's I think there's a semantic issue here that might be causing a bit of miscommunication. So I absolutely agree if we meant standards in the rules and standards sense. So if an agency told a business, well, you must do the right thing, to take an extreme example, that would be terribly confusing, and it would run into the problem that Pound mentioned of, well, the unpredictability of finding out 5 years later that you didn't do the right thing. And absolutely, businesses would sensibly prefer specific rules, no matter how obsolete to them. But that is not a principle in the Dworkinian sense. A principle in the Dworkinian sense is a, it's not a principle in the Fullerian sense that we are discussing. So a principle in the Fullerian sense is a second order principle that regulates administrative procedure. For example, the changing of specific rules. So in the United States, businesses have powerfully advocated in various fora, like the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, powerfully advocated for just the sorts of Fullerian principles that I mentioned. So, for example, if an agency wants to change from one specific rule to another specific rule, they have to offer a justification in light of any reliance interests or business planning interests that their change of rule may be undermining or harming. So in that sense, the issue isn't having a first order standard versus a first order rule. The issue is the second order procedural principles that will govern agencies in switching between what may be very specific first order rules. To put it another way, imagine a business that is faced with a very specific first order rule, but knows that the agency can change it instantly with a snap of the fingers with no need to show why it is harming justified reliance interests. Then having a very specific rule might not help you at all because it's subject to immediate arbitrary change by the agency, and that's where this kind of second order principle becomes important. This is related to the question, are principles more discretionary? Well, yes and no. It's all compared to what? So we have to specify the comparison clearly. So Dworkin's worry was the following, and this is one of his lifelong critiques of positivism, that under positivism, there are rules, but then if the rule is ambiguous, let's say it has a semantic ambiguity or a material ambiguity, there's just a space of discretion left open for the judge to act as a kind of miniature lawmaker. And the judge, in effect, takes off the judge hat and puts on the lawmaker hat just in a very confined space, and by an act of delegated will, resolves the ambiguity one way or another. And for Dworkin, that kind of discretion was a concern. He saw that as a kind of arbitrary discretion on the part of the judge that is addressed by and ameliorated by jurisprudence or principles. So the point of principles is actually to constrain and channel discretion that would otherwise exist under positivism in hard cases. So I don't think we should see the thrust of the argument as trying to expand judicial discretion so much as is the structure and channel judicial discretion that would otherwise obtain. So those are my thoughts for Professor Chen, and I don't know if they're adequate, but happy to hear more. So for Professor Chen, this is very interesting, and I repeat my reply to Professor Peng and others that I just need to learn more. I would say that I want to merely draw one analytic distinction, which is whatever the fault line is, I don't think it's between legislation on the one hand and general principles on the other, because legislation can itself embody general principles. Again, this is the thrust of the so-called natural law codes of early 19th century Europe, and my view of the American Administrative Procedure Act is it has exactly this quality. It's a legislative enactment that itself embodies general principles that have to be elaborated in concrete administrative and judicial decisions. And I'm quoting Dworkin there. And again, the point of seeing it through that lens is, as Dworkin says, if judges had continued to say that law stopped where the explicit code runs out because of the problem of hard cases, they would have had constantly to declare that legality had run out. So the point of this jurisprudence of principles is to, in some rough sense, throw a net of legality over the administrative state without compromising its effectiveness and without arrogating judicial powers to the courts. In that sense, I again can't speak to the Chinese case, but I want to just imagine an idealized situation where we have weak courts and small bureaucracies and ask, what sort of legal form should these weak courts try to promote or pursue in order to cast some kind of boundary of legality over the administrative state? And I think that rules in the jurisprudential sense are a terrible way forward for weak courts in that situation, because the problem with the rules is if they're not complied with, they will simply be violated. And an administrative state that simply ignores or defies rules created by the judiciary may end up being more lawless than an administrative state under a jurisprudence of principle. To put it another way, the jurisprudence of principle doesn't say to administrative bodies, or it barely says, you may not do X, you must do Y. It typically, in the second order procedural way, says if you want to do X, you must do it through path Y. Or if you want to do X, you must first comply with Y. For example, explaining your reasons for switching from one rule to another. So in that sense, principles are less confrontational for courts, and I think that they might be a plausible strategy for weak courts. But that is a completely abstract toy model that, again, I do not at all want to say has anything necessarily to do with the Chinese case. So my bottom line comment for Professor Shen is thank you. That's very illuminating, and forgive my ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. 谢恩夏from Tsinghua University.
Okay, so it's very glad to come here. And actually, I'm an alumni of GPU, also alumni of Harvard and U Chicago. So it's very glad to see my dear professors.
This is so great.
Yeah.
We all know each other.
We know each other. At U Chicago, I worked with Iris Posner and also Gary Becker. So
I know them.
yeah, student of Posner. So I think it's a great topic, and I learned a lot from your talk and the discussion. And actually, I'm teaching law and economics at the Tsinghua, and so probably I want to ask some questions from the perspective of law economics. Actually, in my class, so that will be a topic on regulation. And actually, in the literature, there's a big literature on cost versus regulation. So we know. So firstly, there's a fact. So the fact is, we have seen that there's a rise of the regulation or regulatory state. So you may call it administrative state. So so there's a book by Andrew Schleifer. So it's the rise of the regulatory state or something. Also, I think your co-author Sunston, he's called he has a nickname, the regulatory czar. So he worked in the Obama administration, so there's a lot of regulation. So firstly, if I think about the economic model behind your topic, so probably part versus or what you call it the general principle, and maybe the specific is in the administrative law or regulation. So probably from the economic view, so we can have a specialization of these two departments. So one is specialized, so like the administrative agencies, So they will focus on the more specific descriptions, but the court maybe they address the general principles. So actually, yeah, in the court, so the judges, so they are oftentimes the generalists, and also like for the agencies, so their bureaucrats, they are oftentimes the specialists in that field. So in this sense, probably there's a equilibrium. So like economists won't often use the equilibrium to say that actually probably there's a specialization. So one is the general principles. So in the court or in the more general prudence. But on the other hand, the agencies, so they are doing more specific regulations. So that's one probably that's what I think about the economic model behind this equilibrium. And the other thing is so probably so like the rule versus discretion. So so in the Chicago school, so we know that Friedman so he favors rule versus discretion. So there's some thought on the uncertainty. Probably rule is better, more transparent, and the discretion is like more uncertainty on that. So that's what I think, or like from the rule, from the perspective of the law economics. So I want to comment or suggestions on this explanation. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you brought up the Schleifer book because it's very relevant. I mean, if you look at his work on judicial fact discretion, I think it highlights one of the themes that I've been trying to bring out in my responses today, which is the avoidance of nirvana fallacies. That is, we have to compare the risks on both the side of the administrative state and the side of the courts. And one of Andre's points is that one of the reasons for the rise of the administrative state was that people came to distrust the exercise of judicial discretion. So this is, again, the American path to the administrative state rather than the Chinese path, but I hope there's something illuminating. People came to distrust the judicial exercise of discretion because there was discretion not only in the positive sense I mentioned, when rules are ambiguous or rules run out, but also in the application of law to fact, and indeed the very generation of facts. And that one of the causes for the growth of the administrative bureaucracy was the sense that administrative agencies could be set up in ways that were more transparent and constrained with respect to the exercise of factual discretion and policy-making discretion than courts were. And that seems counterintuitive from a certain perspective, but I think it makes a great deal of sense. Against that background, the idea of rules being more certain, I want to say yes and no. And I think this is a bit of the same conversation I was having with Professor Chen. So the sense in which rules are more certain, you stated very well. The sense in which they're less certain, I think, is threefold. First, we need a dynamic element to our model of rules. If, as I said, we have a rule at time 1, it can be instantly and arbitrarily changed to time 2, then a lot of the certainty benefits of rules are lost. So part of what makes rules more valuable from the standpoint of certainty is the thought that it may be harder or costlier to change them, and in that sense they're more stable, but that's not a given. We need the legal system to make it so that laws are harder or costlier to change for planning purposes. And the Fullerian principles that I mentioned, one of their aims is to do that. So from an economic perspective, they raise the cost of changing rules by requiring, for example, further explanation. A second way in which rules aren't necessarily more certain is something I mentioned as well, which is that because rules don't have a dimension of weight, they can be brittle. That is, they're either complied with or broken. And if, in an imperfect world, we develop an administrative state that with some frequency simply ignores or defies rules, then rules may end up producing actually less legal certainty than would a principle that has a dimension of weight and that can be more or less complied with. And the third sense in which rules may be less certain is just the interpretive sense, that it is depending on the theory of interpretation that holds in the jurisdiction, it may be open to legal actors to appeal to the purposes of rules, to appeal to a competing rule and say that they have to be adjusted in some discretionary way. So in that sense, I think it's complicated to say whether rules are more certain. And part of the what I take to be the appeal of the jurisprudence principle is a way of calibrating the use of rules to promote the sort of benefits you mentioned. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes left for our talk. So Adrian, do you want to open up maybe for one or two questions from the from our audience online?
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Anyone who's raised? Okay, so Adrian, I think someone has posted a question to you in writing from Cao Wenjiao.
Okay, so Professor Vermeule, what do you think of the role of information technology in solving the problems of the administrative state in the U.S., given that the administrative state derives from the complexity of modern society? The legal technologies, legal metrics, big data help in producing norms or rules strained from Dworkin and back to pound? Do they face the legitimacy problem in the U.S.? Great question. I should warn you that my children call me a quote boomer unquote with respect to technology, so I'm not sure I'm the best position to answer this question. But I'll just say a word with respect to what I take to be the really testing or limiting case of this good question, which is the use of artificial intelligence technology by administrative agencies. It's something that we've started to struggle with in the United States, and the agency on whose council I'm privileged to serve, the Administrative Conference of the United States, has issued a number of reports and has ongoing questions about this. And I think that from the standpoint of the question, the use of artificial intelligence has undisputed promise, but it also produces as many complexities as it solves. So I'm not sure that it's a kind of solution for the complexity problem in the administrative state. The complexities that it introduces relate in many respects to what we've been discussing. They relate to the role of principles in administrative law and administrative jurisprudence. So, for example, one of the debates that has come up in with respect to artificial intelligence is how it relates to the fundamental arbitrary and capricious standard of our Administrative Procedure Act. And in what sense can an algorithm be or not be arbitrary and capricious? So, for example, if an administrative agency determines via algorithm that I have violated a rule, and no human has made themselves a first-order judgment that I have violated the rule, is that better from the standpoint of minimizing arbitrary agency action, or is it worse from the standpoint of minimizing arbitrary agency action? People have made arguments in both directions, and you can immediately see how it works. From one standpoint, the point of an algorithm is to minimize human bias, error, prejudice, and discretion in the application of legal rules. From another standpoint, there's another sense of arbitrariness in which it is a kind of like a Kafka machine to have an algorithm declare me subject to a penalty without the judgment, first order judgment intervening of any human official appointed by valid delegation from the sovereign lawmaker to judge my case. So I wouldn't say that information technology exactly provides a solution to complexity. I think it provides a whole new realm, a different realm of complexity. I mean, that's good because it'll keep us administrative lawyers in work. We'll have a lot to write about in the future, but I think it's simply ambiguous or ambivalent from the standpoint of the question. But thank you.
Adrian, how about, since the audience seems a little bit silent online, shall we let our commentators to maybe have some feedback to your response to them? Professor 永乐还在吗？这样我会传传或者代替你们。Anyone in the conference room, our students or Professor Thompson, want to have some conversation and response?
Yes, actually, it's a question I forgot to ask about. It's also related to the background of your thesis. As I understand, there has been several rounds of debate about the fundamental legitimacy of the administrative state in the United States. As you mentioned in your talk, in your paper, and your book, the APA was considered as a grand compromise between the Martian opposing side on whether or not the New Deal was legitimate or not. What are the causes behind the recent rise or re-rise of this debate in the United States? Is it just a repetition of history, or is there any new trends or developments in the United States in terms of both the academic and public attitudes towards the administrative state in the US? Does it have anything to do with President Trump? Thank you.
Good. Thank you. This debate precedes Trump, but I think it did become even more heated under President Trump. But it's been really going on in its, as you accurately say, its current round for much longer than that. I'd say really since the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, so the middle 2000s. I don't want to overstate the scope of the debate. As far as I can make out, there's no serious public constituency for some sharp curtailment of the administrative state. I mean, politicians in an election campaign might say something about unelected bureaucrats, but it seems to be mostly at the level of campaign rhetoric and not some sort of sustained public course of opinion. But that's just my view. What it really is a phenomenon within a sector of the so-called conservative legal movement in the United States. So this is a legal movement that has defined itself with respect to a view called originalism, which is an attempt to return to the original understanding of the Constitution. And the reason that debate is heated up lately is that Republican presidents, for various reasons, have appointed a substantial majority of judges and justices, many of whom are originalists. And so this is kind of put the relationship between the administrative state and the original Constitution on the agenda. Now, that said, I just want to reiterate, I don't accept the premise. And one of the main fault lines in the debate is the validity of the premise, that there's some tension between the administrative state and the original Constitution. And what you've seen just in the past couple of years is a wave of scholarship by on subjects like a delegation from Congress and the historical origins of the administrative state, that in my view have rather powerfully shown that the administrative state has been a feature of the American legal order from the beginning, and in fact, before the writing of the federal Constitution in 1789, it was a feature of the colonial states in America before that as well. So, without accepting any of the premises laid out in this debate, I will say the impetus for it is a view that the original Constitution has, in some sense, been betrayed or departed from, and that our current order is, in that sense, pervasively legally illegitimate. Now, what response to that, if it were true, what the response to that is another fault line. So some people would radically curtail the scope of the administrative state. Some would say it's illegitimate, but there's nothing that can be done about it, and so on. The debates are endless. But I just hope to give you some sense of the basic impetus behind it. Our reaction in the Long Leviathan book is to try to offer something like an unsatisfactory treaty of peace. If you think of the Peace of Westphalia in European history between contending factions in the wars of the 16th century, then going forward, that's the kind of thing we have in mind. That kind of treaty is not satisfactory to anyone, almost by its nature, but it provides an equilibrium that allows a kind of coexistence. Thank you.
Professor Vermeule, yeah, maybe I'm honored to raise the last question for tonight, but may I ask the question beyond your topic?
Please, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very curious about what's happening in the United States, particularly about the division of political parties. So my question is, could you please say something about the impact of the division of political parties in shaping the administrative state or administrative law in the United States? Maybe it's a broad question. I'm sorry I raised the question, but I'd like to know about that, about your take on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I can do it justice without being even more long-winded than usual. I'll say that we suffer from radical political polarization between the main electoral parties in the United States. Each of those parties are in turn sort of umbrella factions that themselves contain warring elements within them. And the result, I think, is fair to say that if you compare it to the baseline of, for example, a Westminster system, a classical Westminster system, our system of separation of powers at the top level with a very large and complicated administrative state generated out of that separation of powers. That system, I don't think, is well set up in some sense to cope with extreme party polarization. And we see a lot of incoherence in policymaking, and what might be even more damaging is the rapid switches in administrative policymaking over time. And this is something I was bringing up earlier. So when the administration of one party comes in, we see important administrative rules immediately reversed by the other party, and then they get reversed back by the other party. And in that kind of world, I think the Fullerian principles that I'm attracted to might seem all the more attractive. So in some sense, legal theories always arises from a concrete situation, and it may be that my attraction to Fullerian principles arises from this sense of the instability and incoherence of administrative policymaking under sharp political polarization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect timing, Adrian. We're just on time on schedule for our talk. Thank you so much. I think at the end of the talk, I certainly feel like as the principles are the savia for the administrative state. The instability and the instability has been attacked by people from whichever ideology as a problem imposed by the ever-expanding administrative state. But your proposal that the Fullerian principles might have provided a solution to stabilize the decision-making process, the rule-making process by the administrative state, which might be the proper response to the reality that we can't really rely upon court or the legislators to react to the complexity, to the fast-changing society. We have to rely upon the administrative state. Plus, we have these powerful corporations, which seems having a problem of self-regulating the influence that they're having on individuals' life, on society. So I guess that's probably where China and the United States are united, are confronting, we're sharing the same problems in our societies. And this might be also the shared approach that we need for both our administrative agencies. So thank you very much, Adrian. I enjoyed very much, just exactly like how much I enjoyed my first administrative law lesson that I took from you in Chicago. So this is wonderful. And thanks all the commentators, our audience in the conference room who came to this chilly autumn fall night in Beijing after the heavy rain. Really, really challenging to come over. Our administrative team, our support team who has worked through the execution beautifully, and also thanks to everyone who got online during the holiday, in the evening of our holiday, to enjoy the talk. So thanks everyone. Thanks Adrian for getting up so early today.
No, it's been wonderful, and I just want to end by thanking you all again for very clear-minded, rigorous, and helpful questions, and it was just really fun for me. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Adrian. As far as I know, this is your first talk to the Chinese audience. Is that right? Either online or
yes.
Okay. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope this is will set a great start for your future journey with our Chinese scholars and China. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Hope to meet you in person.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
Look
Yeah,
forward to
thank
it.
you. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a great day. 谢谢张老师。Thanks. 哦，你要他不会搞那个视频，
咱们到时候新闻就感觉
P上去就完了。对 ，P 也是。
应该有看过，就是好多那个吧，那个就是如果录屏的话，里面抓一个。
对，从
他那个也行，他们后面至少是整洁的。
对，
反正咱们海报放上去，新闻都好。
好的，辛苦了。